In the winter of 1989, every grain farmer in Lac-Saint-Jean County, Quebec, dried their harvest the same way. This was not a choice. It was weather. It was the way the fog came off the lake in September, the way the barley came in wet every third year, the way the cooperative elevator on Route 169 had a sign on the door that said, authorized Beaumont, authorized dealer. Vertex Systems and everyone read that sign the same way they read a stop sign. You stopped. You did not ask what was on the other side. Let me tell you about Fernand Côté, because you need to understand who he was before you can understand what he did with 12 years and a barn full of equipment that everyone else had written off. Fernand was 52 years old in 1989 and had been farming the same 280 acres outside of Alma, Quebec, for 27 years. His father, Raoul, had bought the land in 1955 with money from a decade of logging in the Laurentides and a decade of saying no to everything that was not essential. Raoul had built the first grain storage bin himself in 1958. Using corrugated steel panels he drove to Chicoutimi to buy and a set of hand tools he kept in a canvas roll that Fernand still had hanging in the machine shed. Fernand had been 8 years old when his father built that bin. He had handed him tools when asked, and that was how Fernand Côté learned that storing grain was not something you paid someone else to understand. It was something you figured out yourself, in your own barn, with your own hands, in the specific conditions of your own land. By 1989, Fernand ran 3 grain dryers on his property. None of them were Vertex units. His were grain guard tower dryers, the older continuous flow design, the kind that had been manufactured in Brantford, Ontario since the early 1960s. He had bought his first one, used in 1971, for $1,800 from a retiring farmer outside of Robertville. He had rebuilt the burner himself with parts he ordered directly from the manufacturer. He had bought 2 more over the following decade. Same design, different ages, same logic. He had the service manuals. He had the thermocouple testers and the plenum pressure gauges and the burner alignment tools. He kept a logbook for each dryer. A green Hilroy notebook, the kind you buy at a Pharmaprix, 1 notebook per machine with every service entry, every temperature reading, every propane consumption figure going back to 1971. Fernand Côté did not believe in guessing. He believed in measuring. The man who ran authorized Beaumont was named Roland Taberge, and Roland Taberge was everything Fernand was not, in the way that the dealership world reliably produces. He was 48 years old in 1989, compact and quick-moving, the kind of man who wore a pressed shirt to a farm visit and considered that a form of argument. He had built agri-secage from a single-bay repair shop into a 7-employee operation over 18 years. He held the exclusive Vertex dealership for 3 counties, had supply contracts with 2 elevator chains, and had placed somewhere north of 300 drying units in Lac-Saint-Jean and Saguenay since 1974. When Roland Taberge told a farmer his dryer was finished, the farmer bought a new one. That was the agreement. That was the weather. Now let me tell you what Roland Taberge did with dryers that failed on warranty. The Vertex units he sold were decent machines. They were not bad machines, but they were engineered for the grain profiles of southern Ontario: drier ambient air, lower average moisture content at harvest, more consistent temperature windows between September and November. The harvest conditions around Lac-Saint-Jean were not those conditions. The fog off the lake pushed ambient humidity into ranges the Vertex heat exchangers were not calibrated for. Barley came in at 22, sometimes 24% moisture in a bad September. And the Vertex units, running their factory-set plenum temperatures, would cycle unevenly under those conditions, overcooking the outside of the kernel, leaving moisture trapped at the core, or cycling the burner so rapidly in high-humidity ambient air that the heat exchangers stress-cracked at the welds within 2 or 3 seasons. When a Vertex unit failed under warranty, Roland's protocol was to pull it, ship it back to the distributor in Mississauga, collect the replacement, and reinstall. The failed unit came back marked uneconomical to rebuild, which in distributor language meant we would rather ship you a new one than pay a technician to diagnose this, which Roland Desberges translated into his own working vocabulary as scrap. Except Roland did not scrap them. He stacked them in the back half of his equipment building, a cinder block structure behind the main shop with a concrete floor and a steel door that had not closed flush since 1983. The failed dryers went there. By 1991, there were 8 of them. By 1994, there were 19. By 2001, there were somewhere between 30 and 40, depending on whether you counted the partial units and the burner assemblies that had been pulled and crated separately, and the heat exchanger section stacked along the north wall. Roland Desberges was not saving them for a reason he could explain. He just had not gotten around to calling the scrap dealer. That is a different thing from keeping them, but the shape of it looks the same from the outside. Let me tell you about what Fernand Côté had been noticing, because he had been noticing it quietly for a long time. Fernand had watched the Vertec failures accumulate across the county the way a careful man watches the water level in a drainage ditch, not with alarm, just with attention. He had talked to the agronomist at the Mapacu office in Alma about harvest moisture patterns in the region. He had read the Vertec installation documentation that Roland's parts counter had provided him once, when he asked for it. He had noted that the factory plenum temperature settings were specified for grain entering the dryer at a moisture content of between 16 and 19%. He had been measuring his own grain at intake with a Dickie John moisture meter since 1978. In September of 1984, during a particularly wet harvest, he had recorded intake moisture readings between 23 and 26% across 4 consecutive days. He had written those numbers in the front cover of his #1 dryer notebook in red ballpoint and drawn a box around them. He had not mentioned this to Roland Desberges. Roland had not asked. What Fernand understood, and what Roland did not, was that the grain guard continuous flow design handled high moisture grain differently. The tower geometry allowed a longer dwell time in the drying column, which meant the heat worked on the grain more slowly and more evenly. And the burner modulation on the older grain guard units was mechanical rather than electronic, a bimetallic thermostat and a simple gas valve that responded to plenum temperature directly, without the sensor lag that the Vertec electronic controllers introduced. The grain guard did not fight the humidity. It slowed down and worked with it. It was not a better dryer in every situation. It was a better dryer in this situation, for this lake effect climate, for this harvest window, for grain that came in wet and needed to come out right. Fernand had understood this by approximately 1976, when he had pulled his first grain guard unit for its 5-year inspection and found the heat exchanger welds intact and the burner orifice worn by a measurable amount, but still within specification. The design had anticipated this kind of wear. It had been built with margins for it. In the summer of 1993, Fernand drove to Agri-Sachade-Beaumont on a Wednesday morning to buy a set of thermocouple probes for his own machines. He placed the order at the parts counter, and while the counterman was pulling his order, he walked around the side of the building to where the equipment yard opened onto the back. The cinder block building's steel door was standing open a few feet. He could see the stacked dryer cabinets inside. He stood at the door for a moment. Then he walked back to the parts counter, collected his probes, and drove home. That evening, he called Roland Desberges. He told Roland he had seen the equipment in the back building. He told Roland he thought he could use some of it. He explained that the Vertec cabinet frames and the discharge auger assemblies were compatible with grain guard burner and heat exchanger components, if you had the right adapter plenum section fabricated, and that he had been thinking for some time that a hybrid rebuild using the grain guard heat transfer geometry inside a Vertec cabinet might produce a unit that would handle the regional moisture conditions better than either stock design. He told Roland he would clear out the back building and pay for the scrap steel on whatever Roland could not use, and if the experiment worked, he would report back what he found. The silence on the other end of the line lasted about 5 seconds. Then Roland Desberges laughed. It was not a contemptuous laugh, and that is worth saying precisely. It was the laugh of a man who has spent nearly 2 decades moving iron, and who has developed, through that experience, a complete and working model of what is possible and what is not possible in his industry, and who hears a proposal that falls entirely outside that model, and whose first response is to place it in the category of things that don't require a serious answer. It was a laugh that said, I have 300 units in this region and supply contracts with 2 elevator chains, and I think I know a few things about grain drying, Fernand. It was a laugh that was entirely about Roland Taberge's relationship with his own certainty and had nothing to do with Fernand Côté. But Fernand was the one who had to listen to it. Roland told him the units in the back building were finished. He told him the heat exchangers were cracked and the burner controls were corroded and the cabinet frames had taken water and the insulation was compromised. He told him that a hybrid rebuild was not something any manufacturer would support or document, and that if Fernand put a cobbled machine on a full-grain bin and something went wrong, he was on his own. He said cobbled with a very specific weight, the weight of a man who has decided the conversation is already over. Fernand said he understood. He asked if he could have the units. Roland said, sure, come get them. It would free up the floor space. Fernand said he would be by the following week. Let me tell you about the 12 years that followed, because they are the reason this story is told the way it is told in Lac-Saint-Jean County. Fernand borrowed his nephew's flatbed and made 4 trips to Agri-Séchage over 2 weeks. He came away with 31 dryer cabinets in various condition, 14 separate burner and heat exchanger assemblies, and 3 flatbed loads of auger components, plenum ducting and control panels that he sorted into bins in his equipment shed. He tagged each unit with a strip of orange flagging tape and a number in black marker. He started a new Hilroy notebook. What he found when he began disassembly was more or less what he had expected and in some ways better. 22 of the 31 cabinet frames had heat exchangers that were cracked at the welds, exactly the failure mode he had diagnosed from the outside. He set those aside without sentiment. 9 of the cabinets had heat exchangers that were salvageable, surface corrosion, no structural cracking, the tube bundles intact. Those 9 went on to sawhorses under the good lighting. The burner assemblies were a different matter. 26 of the 31 burner packages were mechanically sound. The Vertec electronic controllers had failed, water intrusion, corroded circuit boards, sensor failures, but the gas valves and burner heads themselves were intact. He cleaned them, tested them for leakage with soapy water and a hand pump, recorded every measurement. Then he started making calls. He called the Grain Guard parts distributor in Brantford, a man named Ed Willoughby who had been selling him parts since 1974. Fernand explained what he was trying to do. Ed listened without interrupting. Ed said the idea was mechanically logical, that the heat exchanger geometry from the Grain Guard tower units would physically fit a modified Vertec cabinet if the plenum adapter section was fabricated correctly, but that Grain Guard would. I keep thinking about that pencil drawing on graph paper, the one Fernand made at the kitchen table on a Saturday night in 1993, dimension to the millimeter, airflow arrows in red ballpoint. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't building a case to show Roland Taberge. He was just solving a problem he had understood for nearly a decade, in the only way he knew how, carefully on paper, with the door closed and no one watching. That's the thing about Fernand that stays with me. He didn't need to be believed to keep working. When Roland laughed on the phone, Fernand said he understood and then went and did exactly what he said he was going to do, not out of spite, not to prove a point, because the fog still came off the lake every September and the barley still came in wet, and the mismatch between the equipment and the climate was still real, regardless of whether the man with the dealership jacket wanted to acknowledge it. The truth of the problem didn't require Roland's permission to exist. I think about the kind of integrity that takes, not the loud kind, not the kind that announces itself at co-op meetings or expects someone to be watching, the quiet kind, where you do the right work because it's the right work, and you write it all down in a green Hilroy notebook because the measurements matter whether or not anyone ever reads them. Fernand kept service records on machines that no manufacturer would support, for customers who didn't know yet that they needed him. He kept them because he believed that understanding something precisely was its own form of honesty. That notebook, going back to 1971, wasn't nostalgia. It was a moral position. And then there's what it actually cost him to get there. 12 years, 4 flatbed loads, $19,000 of his own money spent on parts and fabrication before a single neighbor called Dome. He ran the first test unit for 48 hours and logged the plenum temperatures every hour before he would call it done. That's not impatience managed. That's something deeper, a willingness to work through the long middle of a thing without any guarantee that the end is coming. Most people stop somewhere in that middle. They get tired, or they get discouraged, or they decide the effort isn't worth it if no one's noticing. Fernand just kept going, the way you keep going when you understand that the work itself is the answer, and the recognition is beside the point. What Roland built collapsed not because he was a bad man, but because he stopped being curious. He stopped asking why the same heat exchanger kept cracking. He learned to manage the failure as a revenue stream, instead of asking what the failure was trying to tell him. That's a slow erosion. That kind of incuriosity. It doesn't feel dangerous until the day a farmer across the county has been quietly solving the problem you stop looking at, and the warranty terms change, and the contracts lapse, and the building you sized for 7 people holds 3. Claire understood what her father had built, and Etienne is understanding it after her. That continuity isn't luck. It's what happens when someone models over a lifetime that measurement is respect, that patience is a form of rigor, and that the only honest response to a problem you can see is to keep working on it until it's solved. The Green Hilroy notebooks on that shelf are the record of a man who lived that way, season after season, for 54 years. The dryers are still running. The fog still comes off the lake in September, and the barley still comes in wet, the way it always has, the way it always will. Fernand knew that. He just made sure his machines were ready for it.